This lecture is entitled The Crisis of the Later Middle Ages, 1300 to 1450, the Black Death. The Black Death is the definitive plague of the medieval period. The Black Death comes from the Latin phrase atra mors. Today, we call it the bubonic plague. In other words, if you were to travel back to the 14th century, which definitely would not be a good idea because given the odds you would die of the Black Death, but if you were to travel back to the 14th century, you would discover that the people who lived through this disease outbreak called the disease the Black Death. And that is because of the bruised appearance of a plague victim's body. Essentially, what happens in the Black Death, or atra mors in Latin, is that the body begins to decompose and rot before the person actually dies. So a person suffering from the Black Death would get the very distinct displeasure of seeing their body rot away before their eyes. They would experience decomposition of their body while still alive. If today you were to perform research in a medical library or in a medical dictionary, and if you looked up the Black Death, what you would see is that you would be referred to the bubonic plague. So if you were to look up the Black Death in a medical dictionary or encyclopedia, most times you'll be referred to the bubonic plague, which is what we call it today. So for the people who lived through it, this disease was the Black Death. In modern times, we call it the bubonic plague for the swelling of the buboes. Essentially, during the Black Death, a person experiences not only decomposition, but the first telltale signs of infection with the Black Death or bubonic plague is the swelling of the lymph nodes and also big, it's disgusting, pus-filled lumps that come up over the whole of the body. These were called buboes. We know today that the bubonic plague or Black Death is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. And if you're going to have a plague, a bacterial plague is the best kind to have today in modern times, at least, because bacteria is treatable by antibiotics. An outbreak of a virus is very devastating because there is no treatment in modern times for a virus. Now, what I mean by that is you can treat the symptoms of a virus, but you have to wait for the virus to run its course. So it's much easier to treat a bacteria with antibiotics than a virus. So let me just say here that if we were to travel back to the 14th century, there was no cure for the Black Death, even though it is treatable with antibiotics, because antibiotics were not invented until the 20th century. So, where does the Black Death come from? And there are several ways to ask or think about this question. If you were to ask the people who suffered through this outbreak of the Black Death from 1348 to 1350, what is the origin of this disease? Where did it come from? They would have said that it was divinely sent, that it was sent to Europe by God as a punishment for sinful activity, that Europe was being punished for not being religious enough. God was wiping out the bad people, quote unquote, with a plague. The other way to look at this is geographically. Where did the disease originate? Well, we know that the Black Death is indigenous to Mongolia, or what today would be the modern-day country of Mongolia. That's north of China today, but in the time period that we're looking at here, the 14th century, it would have been called Mongol China. That disease, the Black Death or bubonic plague, was indigenous to Mongol China. It was found among the black rat population there, and the Chinese people living in Mongolia had developed ways to deal with an outbreak of this pestilence. Whenever they would see a large-scale rat die off, they would pick up and move. They had learned ways to combat and prevent the spread of infection. So that disease from Mongolia, or Mongol China, makes it to Europe by 1348. How does it get there? Well, this is pretty cool. In 1347, there were some merchants from Genoa, Italy, we call them Genoese merchants, who happened to be over in a Black Sea trading port called Kaffa, which can be spelled with a K or with a C. Kaffa was a trading port on the Black Sea, in today what would be the area of Russia. So these merchants from Genoa, Italy, were trading there when suddenly the city of Kaffa came under siege by a group of Mongolian tribespeople called the Mongols, and they were led by their king or Khan called Janibeg. Now, you've probably heard of the Mongols before, sometimes called the Mongol Horde. The most famous Mongol Khan probably is Genghis Khan, who united the Mongols first in the 13th century. Well, here we are in the 14th century, and the Khan at this time is Janibeg. Janibeg wanted to take over Kaffa, add it to Mongol territory. So he laid siege to that city while Genoese merchants were there to trade. Unfortunately, Janibeg notices that some of his men have become sick, and he recognizes immediately that this is the illness that's caused by the black rat. So he knows that avoidance is the best way to prevent the spread of this disease among his soldiers. So what he does is he takes the dying and affected soldiers who have come into contact with these rats and with other people who've had contact and are apparently beginning to show the signs of infection. He puts them in catapults, and he goes right up to the walls that surround Kaffa, and he throws the dying and dead bodies of his soldiers over the walls into Kaffa. This is the first instance in history of biological weaponry. Janibeg is purposefully infecting the people of Kaffa to weaken them, to make it easier to take over that city. So he throws the bodies over, he moves his men away from the city. His men are fine, they've gotten rid of the infected soldiers, they have been thrown over the walls into Kaffa, where their bodies are decomposing and releasing tons and tons of bacteria into the air. The Genoese merchants who are there trading think, well, this is pretty gross. These dead, smelling bodies that obviously have something really wrong with them. Look at all these sores and swellings, and it's just pretty disgusting. But they don't really think too much of it until a few days later, when people throughout the city of Kaffa become suddenly violently ill with this horrific disease that is horrible in its smell and in its appearance. And the merchants from Genoa think we should leave immediately to avoid getting this disease. They do not understand germ or contagion theory in Europe at this point. They thought disease was spread by bad smells. This is called the miasmatic theory of disease. So they believe that if they hang around in that city and they smell these sick people, that they too will get sick. So they board their ships and head back to Genoa, Italy. Whew, sighing relief. Thankfully, we have avoided getting this sickness. Little did they know it was too late. They were already infected, and in the return voyage home to Genoa, Italy, many of these merchants become sick and die. Those who arrive in Genoa, who are alive, do not realize that they too are about to be sick and infected with this disease. So they go about their business, trading, living their lives until they too become sick, And then, like wildfire, the disease known as the Black Death spreads throughout Europe. And when we look at a map of the spread of the disease throughout Europe from 1348 to 1350, this disease will ravage Europe for 2 solid years. What we see is that it tends to move in straight lines. And we think, how in the world is that possible, that a disease would move in a straight line of infection? If you plotted the cases, they move in a straight line. That's because the disease is following the roads of this period as people trade and exchange goods and news and services. They also exchange the disease. So, if we asked the people, where does this disease come from? They would have said God. Geographically, we know the origins of that disease are traceable to Mongol China, given to the city of Kaffa by Janibeg the Khan. The Genoese merchants are exposed to it and bring it back to Europe. But, pathologically now, where does the disease come from? It is a disease that is carried by black rats. And it is important for you to imagine here, not cute mice. Black rats are huge, big, nasty critters that can sometimes be the size of a small house cat. Black rats, which were indigenous first to Mongol China, were taken on trading ships throughout Europe. The black rat commonly has in its body Yersinia pestis, the plague bacteria that causes the Black Death or bubonic plague. It rarely sickens a rat to the point of death. Usually, a black rat will carry around this disease and not get sick from it. It's just something that's naturally occurring in its body. But on occasion, if a rat has weakened immunity from something else, then those plague bacteria will start to reproduce very quickly in the rat's system and cause the rat to die. When the rat dies, the fleas that are feeding on that rat, because yes, black rats also carry fleas around, these fleas are looking for a live host. Fleas will feed off of a dead body, but they prefer a living organism on which to feed. So when the black rat dies, his fleas go looking to feed. That is how the disease is given to human beings. The Black Death is a vector-borne disease. That means people do not get the Black Death directly from a black rat. Instead, they get the disease from the flea. By the time a rat dies from Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague or Black Death, the little fleas that are feeding on it have so much plague bacteria in their jaws that it makes it very difficult for them to feed. So they jump off repeatedly, biting, trying to feed without success. And every time they bite unsuccessfully, they inject that plague bacteria into whatever they're biting. And given the fact that people are very dirty in this period, usually bathing only twice a year on Christmas and Easter, people have body lice, fleas, they're nasty, they're smelly, their homes are filthy, they rarely wash their clothes or clean their homes, so a flea bite to them is nothing unusual until these horrible symptoms begin to emerge. So you're probably thinking today, oh well, so what? I'm not worried about the Black Death. This is a disease of history. Actually, every year in this country, 12 people will die from the Black Death on average. And today, in the United States, people do not get the Black Death from black rats. Now, that disease, which had at once been confined to Mongol China, has spread around the globe thanks to trade and shows up in other rodent populations, such as prairie dogs and squirrels. In Los Angeles, California, a few years ago, there was an outbreak of plague bacteria among the squirrels in public parks, and some people fell ill because they had taken their lunches in those parks and had been bitten by fleas and developed this horrible flu-like illness. And fortunately, the doctors responded quickly enough to save the lives of these people. So don't think that it's a disease just of the past. It's actually still out there. The truth is, when we have a population of 300 million people in this country that we know of, 12 deaths from the bubonic plague or Black Death doesn't seem like much, but it's still there. Unfortunately, these days we have worse concerns actually for an epidemic disease breakout, such as the avian or bird flu or the swine flu. And what is especially concerning about those, as I said previously, is that they are viruses, not bacterial plagues. So, what are the types of the Black Death? This is a little known fact, but there were actually 3 different strains of the Black Death. There's the bubonic form of the disease, which is spread from black rats to human beings by fleas and is characterized by the swelling of the buboes. Unfortunately, a person does not have to have contact with just a flea infected with the disease to get it. It was also transmissible from person to person. One of the last stages of the bubonic plague was coughing, sneezing, extreme mucus and phlegm production, in other words, respiratory illness. And when a person started coughing and sneezing and hacking in those last stages of the bubonic plague, he or she was coughing and sneezing and basically spraying plague bacteria right out into the air that another person would then breathe in and be infected by. So the pneumonic form of the plague is characterized by human-to-human transmission, by coughing and sneezing plague bacteria into the air. The pneumonic was the most contagious form of the plague. The other form or type of the plague was the septicemic strain of the bubonic plague, and it is characterized by extreme blood infection. Whereas someone might suffer from the bubonic plague or pneumonic strain of the plague for 3 to 5 days, a person with the septicemic form of the plague might contract that form or strain early in the morning and be dead by middle of the afternoon. It worked extremely fast. When the plague bacteria were introduced directly into the bloodstream, they reproduce rapidly and cause extreme blood infection and death. So, how does a person get septicemic plague? I have to apologize here. Some of what I'm about to talk about is pretty disgusting, so it is necessary that you know about this, and I apologize that it's so gross, but it's just the way it is. In this time period of the 14th century, people did not understand disease or how to treat it. They did the best they could, and one of the most common practices was left over from ancient Greece and Hippocrates, who said that bleeding or bloodletting was an effective treatment to keep the humors in balance. Many quote-unquote medical professionals in this period thought that the plague was caused by either smelling someone who was sick from it, or 2, by an imbalance of the humors, specifically too much blood. So the way to get rid of too much bad blood is to make an incision and bloodlet the person. The unfortunate thing that happens here is, of course, they're not wearing gloves and they're not concerned about hygiene or sanitation. So, and if the person who's performing the bloodletting has some sort of cut or open sore on his or her hand, then that infected blood would get into that open sore and death would occur within hours. Another way that the septicemic form of the plague was spread, and here again I apologize, this is so gross, was that these buboes would swell as big as a grapefruit, and they would be full of this horribly smelling, thick, foul, pussy discharge that some said was like white, gray, or black, and it would have the consistency of what we know today as like mayonnaise. And people would beg, please squeeze that or try to lance it and give me some relief from the pressure and the heat that's coming out of that thing. And so if a person attempted to squeeze all of this discharge out of one of these buboes, they could then be infected with a septicemic form. So what are the symptoms of the bubonic pneumonic septicemic plague? Well, first of all, there was a tingling sensation in the body, like one was being pricked with tiny arrows, as they said. Then a fever, a high fever, would set in, followed by blackening of the skin. Then rosy rings would appear on the skin, followed by the swelling of the buboes or lymph nodes and other pus-filled sores. The person would then begin to experience flu-like symptoms, achiness, lethargy, just absolutely exhausted, could not continue, just had to lay down. Then would be gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, and diarrhea. And the vomit from the plague has a distinctive appearance in that it looks like coffee granules. It's black vomit. So the person would then begin to rot and decompose. All of this would take about 3 to 5 days. And as I said earlier, the decomposition occurs while the person is still alive. There were no cures for the Black Death in the 14th century. It is treatable today with modern antibiotics. What they attempted to do in the 14th century was bloodletting, lancing, draining the buboes, purging the sick person, in other words, giving them some concoction that would make them vomit or have diarrhea even more. The lancing, draining, purging, bloodletting, more or less, served to hasten a person's death. No one ever thought, oh, well, we're purging people and it's making them sicker or weaker, or we're bloodletting these people and they're getting sicker and they're dying. They never associated that their treatments could be harming the patient rather than helping them. They attributed a sharp decline in the patient or the patient's death with the progression of the disease, not with some harmful treatment that was administered. This, too, is a bit disgusting, and I'm just going to share it with you. The medical professionals of the time believed that onions could be used as a treatment. So you imagine a person lying there in bed, decomposing, and how horrible that would smell. Then imagine adding hot, steamed onions to these various sores, which was believed to be a possible cure. They also allowed pigeons to peck at the buboes. The idea was that the pigeons would peck these buboes, pop them open, and the stuff would drain out and the people would get better. I know you're wondering, would a pigeon actually do that? Yes, if you've ever had any experience with birds, especially chickens and pigeons, the only way I know to describe this is, and some of you who've been around them will probably say, yeah, that's exactly the way it is. They have sort of like an OCD personality, like obsessive compulsive. If a chicken or a pigeon sees a sore on another chicken or pigeon, they're so curious about it, they will just peck at it, and then everybody else in the flock gets interested. Oh, let me peck at it too. And so they all peck, and they peck the poor bird with the sore to death. So yeah, you can get a pigeon started on a sore and it will peck at it. And I'll just tell you, there is some evidence that squeezing the bubo and draining it was beneficial. But the key to success was that every smidge of that thick, foul, pussy substance had to be taken out of the bubo. If any was left inside it, the person would not recover. They also would cut roosters, and here again, I'm sorry it's disgusting, but they would cut roosters from their throat down to their groin, and they would pull them open to expose the innards of the rooster. They would then cut the bubo in the groin area of the plague patient. They would slit it, and they would lay these two slits together. Their screwed up logic was that the plague bacteria would come out of the person into the rooster. You know, what this did, more or less, was transfer even more bacteria from the rooster's guts into the plague victim and made him or her sicker. So let's quickly talk about the medical professionals, quote unquote, of the time. If a person was sick, dying from the plague, who would he or she call for? Well, their first thought is to call for a doctor or physician. Actually, in the medieval period, a physician or a doctor was someone who theorized about the cause and treatment of disease. He never saw patients. So it's probably the physicians who come up with these crazy things like, put some onions on it, because they don't see what happens when you put onions on a plague victim. There are also in this period what we call surgeons. And you're probably thinking, that's somebody who performs surgery. Well, not in the medieval period. A surgeon in the medieval period was a doctor who made house calls. But surgeons were extremely expensive. So actually the medical professional that treated plague victims, if the plague victim could afford treatment, was a man called a barber surgeon. This is a doctor who makes house calls. A surgeon is a person who would set a broken bone or a broken jaw, do some dental work, perform bloodletting, lancing, draining, purging. But because most people could not afford to call for a surgeon had to supplement his income. Hence, barber surgeon. So a barber surgeon was the favored medical professional of this time period. He was a man who would treat or attempt to treat your illness, and also for an additional fee, cut your decomposing face with a razor and give you a nice smooth shave, and then trim your hair for you, which I think is somewhat amusing, that you're dying from the plague, your flesh is rotting off your body, and you're going to be vain enough to pay for a shave and a haircut. But the barber surgeon was the favored medical professional in this time period and was the one who largely treated plague victims. The barber surgeon often had to stop by the local apothecary. That's the medieval word for pharmacy. So any particular potion that was needed to purge a patient, to make him or her throw up or relieve him or herself, to pass the plague out of the body, it was believed, would be obtained at the local pharmacy or apothecary. In this time period of the 14th century, from 1348 to 1350, there were no real cures or medical professionals who experienced overwhelming success in treatment of the disease. There was, however, a French philosopher, better known as a psychic, by the name of Michel de Nostradame, or to us, Nostradamus, who actually nursed his family through the Black Death. They died, but he survived. And he is famous to us in modern times as a psychic, a man who some say predicted Hitler and all sorts of things. But he, in this period, was famed for medical advice, but people wouldn't listen to him because what he was suggesting seemed to them just crazy talk, even though we will recognize it as very commonsensical. What Nostradamus said was his key to survival, and was the key to surviving this disease, was prevention. He said that people should eat well-balanced meals. They should bathe. People thought this was crazy. Bathing? No, everybody knows you have to have a protective layer of dirt on your body. When you bathe your dirt off, you open up your pores and open them up to disease. But he said, no, you've got to be clean. You've got to get rid of all the lice and fleas and things that are on your body. You need to be clean. You need to be sanitary. If you're tending to someone who is ill, cover your nose and mouth. Keep your hands clean and get plenty of fresh air. Open your doors and windows. People were afraid that by smelling someone with the disease, they would get the disease. So they thought opening the doors and windows, no way, we'll smell somebody who's got the disease. If people had listened to Nostradamus, they would have survived much better during this period. Nostradamus also recommended escaping urban areas. If there was a plague outbreak in your community and you knew about it and you could afford it, leave. Go somewhere else. Go out in the countryside where people weren't as crammed in together. And that was an especially effective way to avoid getting the Black Death. Let's talk about now the results of the Black Death. Depopulation. We don't know the exact population figures for Europe in this time period, but we assume it was somewhere between 75 million to 90 million people. In just 2 years, from 1348 to 1350, the population of Europe was cut from 1/3 to 1/2. We don't know exactly. Either 1/3 or 1/2 of the population died. We don't have exact census figures, in other words, but somewhere between a minimum of 25 million people to a maximum of 45 million people died in Europe in just 2 years. Now let me give you something to compare that to. If we say at minimum 25 million people died in 2 years from this disease in Europe, the population of Alabama right now is about 4 million. So you're talking more than 6 times the population of Alabama at minimum. At maximum, 10 times the current population of Alabama. So somewhere between 25 million and 45 million people in Europe died in just 2 years. In some towns, the rate of infection was so extreme that as many as 800 to 1,000 people died per day. When people are confronted with such huge loss of life, they tend to respond in one of two ways. Very heroically, tending to other people, caring for the sick until they too contract the disease and die. And then there are those other people who give in to the sensual pleasures of the time and live it up and have orgies and feasts and things of that sort. And during the outbreak of the Black Death, we see both. There were medical professionals, monks, and nuns who acted very heroically, and family members who would tend to the sick and dying, risking their own lives in the process. Then there were others who abandoned their family members, left them to die, and threw themselves into drinking, orgies, and frenzy of activities with a sort of fatalistic attitude that if this disease is going to get me, it's going to get me while I'm having a good time. Another result of the Black Death is ars moriendi, or morbid art. Art of the 14th century is characterized by grotesqueness, death. Absolutely disgusting and horrifying images appear in art of this period. The art of the 14th century is characterized by images of death, dying, contorting, disfigured bodies, worms, evil spirits. And the reason for that is because people are seeing death all around them, and that is what they paint, and it is what they write about. We write and paint what we know, and what the people of the 14th century knew was death. Also, a result of the Black Death is the rise of a group of people called the Flagellants and anti-Semitism. a group of religious fanatics in Europe called the Flagellants believed that Jews were responsible for spreading the Black Death, which is a completely and totally asinine idea because Jews were dying from the plague as well. But the Flagellants were religious fanatics who dressed themselves in these long, dark, hooded robes, and they had snake-like, curving, waving processions throughout Europe. They would journey for 33 and a half days at a time, one day for each year of Christ's life, and at the end of 33 and a half days, they would stop wherever they were, and they would find a village. They would go into the village, and they would strip down, take off their robes, and they would beat each other with whips made of leather with metal embedded at the end. Flagellant comes from the Latin word flagellum, which means whip, and they would beat themselves. The idea was that if they beat themselves, God would take the Black Death back. If people punished themselves for their sinful ways, God would not feel the need to punish them with this disease. So what the Flagellants would do is they would assume the position of their worst sin, which I think would be very interesting to see if you follow what I'm getting at here. They get in the position of the worst sin that they had committed, and they would freeze in that position. And another member of the Flagellants would beat them as they were in this position of their worst sin. It would beat them with these leather whips. People would come out of their homes and businesses in these villages to watch the Flagellants beat themselves. They would then run out and put their hands in the blood that was pouring off of these backs of these beaten and whipped Flagellants, and they would rub their hands in it and smear it all over their face, attempting to cleanse themselves in the blood of these self-sacrificing people. What actually happened, is that the Flagellants spread one particular form of the disease. If you're paying attention, the septicemic form. So once they had beaten themselves and allowed the village people to smear around in their blood, they would then demand the blood of the Jews and encourage people in the village to go out and find Jewish people, hunt them down, and kill them because they were the ones who were spreading the plague. So, what was the result of the Black Death on marriages, births, and funerals? Well, very few marriages occurred and very few births. The Black Death had a devastating impact on marriage and the birth rate. The reason is, with 1/3 to 1/2 of the population dying, they were too sick to marry, too sick to have children. Let's not forget, too, again, that people believed bad smells caused the disease, so even priests were reluctant to come out to perform a marriage ceremony, much less witnesses. So, and if people aren't marrying, they're also not having children, because in this time period, people married and then had children. Your first thought probably is that the Black Death would result in a large number of funerals, but that is not the case. Again, the reason is people will not attend funerals because they're afraid if they smell the dead person that they're actually going to contract the disease. The other reason goes back to something I said earlier. Imagine 800 to 1,000 people dying per day. There simply are, and that is in some cities, there simply are not enough coffins to go around. There's nobody to manufacture coffins. Nobody wants to attend a funeral or be responsible for organizing the funeral or burying the person. So instead, what happens all across Europe, actually, is that in every town affected by the plague, they would hire these dead collectors who would come around with a cart, and they would ring the bell on the cart and ask for the dead to be brought out into the streets. They would then collect dead people from the streets, and yes, this job paid well because in all likelihood you were going to die from messing around with these dead people. So they would collect the dead, put them in a cart, and go out to the edge of the town, dig a big hole, and they would dump bodies in, put another layer of dirt, more bodies, another layer of dirt, more bodies. These were called plague pits. Rich, poor, middle class people were dumped into a common communal grave, no grave markers, no headstones, no records of who was buried where. They just dumped people into these big holes. I guess in some ways I have kind of a gross sense of humor because I find this somewhat funny. There was a very important Italian writer at this time by the name of Boccaccio, and he said that watching a plague pit being dug and used reminded him of his mother making lasagna. If you think about lasagna, noodles, meat, cheese, layer, 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 and then here's the plague pit, dirt, dead bodies, dirt, dead bodies. That's kind of sick but amusing at the same time. So these people were just thrown pell-mell into these huge plague pits with no grave markers. Another result of the Black Death is gente nuova, that is to say, new rich. And I'll just explain this by way of example. And some of you will think maybe this is a little silly, but it works perfectly. I get excited oftentimes about checking my mailbox because I have this fantasy that someday something good is going to be in there, not just a bill or something, but I'm going to go out to my mailbox and I'm going to find that I have been named heir and successor to some great estate of a long-lost relative who was filthy, stinking rich that I never even knew I had. Now, why am I telling you this? This is exactly what happens during the 14th century. With so many people dying on a daily basis, it was quite common for an inheritance to pass through 3, 4, 5, 6 hands in a single day. And what happens is family fortunes pass from one person to another, and in the space of a week, a family inheritance has been passed through 15 or 16 or 20 or 30 different people, so that some long-lost poor relative suddenly finds that his cousin so-and-so died, and this person is the only surviving heir, now has the whole family fortune. So we literally have the creation of gente nuova, new rich, as a result of the Black Death. People who were poor before, but managed, however, somehow to survive the plague, find themselves awarded with a long-lost inheritance. Also, we see in this period, as a result of the Black Death, peasant revolts. Briefly, I'll just tell you that in 1358, there are revolts in France among the French peasants called the Jacquerie. In 1378, Italian peasants called the Ciompi rebel. And in 1381, the English peasants. What are they rebelling over? Well, essentially, the Black Death results in the end of feudalism. Here's how. The Black Death resulted in a huge labor shortage. So those who work are dying in large numbers, just like those who pray and those who fight. Those who fight, you'll remember, are the great lords, lesser lords, and simple knights, the landowners, who required service from those who work. There was no payment given to serfs or peasants in this period. It was their social obligation to work for those who fought. So when this huge loss of life results from the Black Death, the peasants in France, Italy, and England see an opportunity. And they tell these lords for whom they have worked for free, "Oh, really? You want your land worked? Well, now you have to pay us." And the nobles felt they had no option but to pay. So they began to pay those who worked, the serfs and peasants, for the work that had formerly been done for free as a societal obligation and demand. Well, The peasants demand higher and higher wages. The nobles have no choice but to give higher and higher wages. As the Black Death begins to subside, these nobles then raise taxes on their workers, on their laborers, in an attempt to try to take back the majority of the money that they had just paid out in the form of taxes. So they've given large sums of money to workers. They're trying to get back that money now in high taxes. So as a result, the peasants rebel and bring down feudalism. The last little bit of information that I'm just tagging on here, or tacking on at the end of our discussion of the Black Death, is a little information about vernacular literature. After the outbreak of the Black Death, literature across Europe changes. Rather than being written in Latin left over from the Roman Empire, vernacular literature develops, and that's literature that's written in national languages like English, French, and Italian. The most famous writer of the 14th century in England was Geoffrey Chaucer. This lecture is entitled The Crisis of the Later Middle Ages, 1300 to 1450, the Black Death. The Black Death is the definitive plague of the medieval period. The Black Death comes from the Latin phrase atra mors. Today, we call it the bubonic plague. In other words, if you were to travel back to the 14th century, which definitely would not be a good idea because given the odds you would die of the Black Death, but if you were to travel back to the 14th century, you would discover that the people who lived through this disease outbreak called the disease the Black Death. And that is because of the bruised appearance of a plague victim's body. Essentially, what happens in the Black Death, or atra mors in Latin, is that the body begins to decompose and rot before the person actually dies. So a person suffering from the Black Death would get the very distinct displeasure of seeing their body rot away before their eyes. They would experience decomposition of their body while still alive. If today you were to perform research in a medical library or in a medical